I think it's a disgrace that information that was false and fake and never happened got released to the public.
Overall reportage is essentially leftist propaganda.
CNN plays a really important role in mainstreaming Trump's misinformation. And that's because CNN's approach to covering politics often prioritizes drama and spectacle over serious truth-telling.
Anti-labor bias in the country's broadcast media, which under UK regulatory laws are legally required to be balanced in their coverage.
The peaceful Egyptian revolution had a distinct goal, but no clear leader. A handful emerged, including Wael Ghonim. His tweets offered both a narrative and a nudge to protesters.
The Houthis also took over much of the country's media infrastructure, including the state broadcaster Yemen TV. Meanwhile, another channel, also calling itself Yemen TV, is beaming the ousted government's side of the story.
We're not telling our story enough.
We have fallen short of the mark, and when we fail to represent, people switch off.
As you go up the ranks in media, fewer and fewer women and people of color exist at every rung of the ladder.
Republicans originally thought that Fox worked for us, and now we're discovering we work for Fox.
Good morning and welcome. My name is Lukas Rohan and I will be your moderator in our upcoming panel. Today our panellists will be discussing the role of the media and the arts in what many are calling a post-truth society. With the access to technology like smartphones and social media in our pockets, anyone could tell a story. So, how do we decide the stories we tell? We will begin with our 25-minute panel discussion, followed by a 5-minute pause for you in the audience to gather your thoughts and discuss what you've heard with the people you're sitting with. Before we start, I'd like to introduce our panellists here today. On my left is Moritz Hamel, one of our very own ISDL students. Moritz intends on studying film once he graduates in the summer of this year. Beside Moritz is Michelle Mischler, a former journalist and head of Swiss Public Affairs and Sustainability at the World Economic Forum. Beside Michelle is Rosie Garthwaite, a journalist, producer, author, and co-founder of production company Media Dante. Beside Rosie is Kat Kai Kolkez, a self-styled artivist, a transgender writer, performance artist, and activist. And beside Kat is Phil Borges, who's been documenting tribal cultures for over 25 years, highlighting the challenges and abuses they face, as well as their way of life. Thank you all for being here. I'd like to open our panel with the question, how is it that you decide the stories you tell? I'd like to start with Rosie Garthwaite.
Hello, everyone. So I guess there are many different reasons why you decide the stories you tell. Often it's driven, I'm afraid, by financial incentives as well. You know, necessarily you go to where people can pay you for making certain stories. The harder stories are the ones where people are not interested in investing or being a part of the project or giving any of their time up. So I tend to find myself dividing my time between ones that are that people want to pay for and see on their channel, which tend to be the less challenging ones, and then the rest are the things I do in my spare time. When we got our film into the Workers' Cup, which I believe played here recently a few months ago, which is about workers workers in Qatar building stadiums for the World Cup in 2022. We got into Sundance, and a very Oscar award-winning filmmaker said to me on the first night there, she said, "Listen, you can't eat awards. This is a hobby and never think it should be anything else." And so it's been quite relaxing thinking of it as a hobby and enjoying it at the weekends rather than striving every single day and making it less enjoyable over time.
Michelle, as someone who works at the World Economic Forum, how is it that you decide which stories are told at the World Economic Forum?
Well, I have the privilege of being the head of the Open Forum, which is the public-facing event of the World Economic Forum. So I've got a little bit more independence in that sense. So me and my team, we obviously look at the things that are within the World Economic Forum and within the rest of the official program and the various initiatives and projects that we work on throughout the year. But then we really we link it a little bit to that, but we chose topics that we care about and that we really think are important and that mean something to the local public in Switzerland and to the global public. So for us, luckily, we really can kind of push stories and push panels and topics that we think are important, that we really, really care about. So that's actually a really privileged position for us to be in. The World Economic Forum as a whole as well, looks at the global issues, global challenges. This is the things that we try and solve or try and attempt to solve in Davos and throughout the year. And that too, I think these are topics that are close to everybody's heart. They're topics that matter. So yeah, we're in a really, I have to say, I think probably in a privileged position where we can kind of drive the agenda.
Moritz, once you finish studying film, you intend on making films, I'm sure.
Yeah.
What do you think that process should look like of deciding what story to tell, what movie to shoot?
Well, from personal experience, usually the stories I tell, they come to me. I don't look for them.
Mm-hmm.
And I was talking about this also last night with Phil, that when I traveled to Tanzania, I came there very open-minded, and with the intent to make a documentary, but I was not set on what story I was going to tell. It wasn't until I met people like Daniel, a graduating student from Arusha, that I realized that I wanted to tell their story about the importance of education in Tanzania. And I feel like from a student's perspective, my storytelling ability is not yet monetarily driven, as Rosie was saying. Which is why I think it's so great for our student population to be able to create and express themselves
before that becomes
a priority. Exactly.
Kat, you founded your own theatre company in Botswana. How is it that process looks for you?
Quite poor. So that's why I was laughing when Rosie said, you kind of go to where you're getting paid to tell the stories, and unfortunately, I don't come from a country that has an economy where you can get paid to tell a story without then being told what stories to tell. So the reason I have a theatre festival is because I do a lot of other work that is very not theatre related. And then whatever money I make there, I then sort of start coercing people to believe in this dream that we can tell such stories.
So it's a sort of a passion project that's funded by the more.
It's a passion project that somehow managed to gain attention globally. So for the most part, when people say, "Oh, congratulations on doing this, and you're doing such great work," I'm like, "Well, tell that to the people in the country that I come from," because it's still a space of privilege to witness or engage with the stories that I tell, but they need to be told so that somebody else can believe that these stories are worth being told. They're not just always being told from somewhere far away, seen through a TV screen, or you have to get onto a train, a plane, or a bus to go and see them. They can happen in your backyard.
Phil, your recent project Crazy Wise, which you'll be talking about after this panel in a keynote, Crazy Wise explores how traditional shamanic practices could be relevant to the way we treat mental health in America and in Western Europe. Why that story?
Well, that story is one that came to me. Many of my stories do come to me. It isn't like I plan them. Something happens and I notice. So in this case, I spent almost 30 years in indigenous and tribal communities, and I began to notice the healers in these communities. I was doing mainly human rights stories, and the healers I found, the people we call shaman, were identified by having what we would call in the Western world a psychotic break, many times. Not always, but often. And then I happened to meet somebody in my own community in Seattle, where I live, who had had a psychotic break, and it just became something I was following. I followed his story and brought the two together. So it was kind of a natural process.
Yeah.
It wasn't like I decided one morning, I'm going to do a story on mental health. No, it was like it evolved out of other things I was doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
On our panel today, we've actually got two journalists, or two journalists who, former journalists. There's a quote here that I have from an opinion column for CNN by Timothy Stanley, and he wrote that, and I quote, "The press is staffed by human beings, and those human beings have prejudices conditioned by race, class, gender, and region." To what extent do you agree with this statement, Michelle?
It's probably true. I mean, you know what you know, and you know where you view the world through the lens that you've been given by who you are and where you grew up. So yeah, it's probably true.
Yeah.
But then it's up to education and the wider world to kind of open up that viewpoint and that kind of limited. And I think as educators and as parents, it's our job to try and create a generation that has a very open mind. And I think I have I feel very optimistic for this for your age and my daughters.
And Rosie, if we accept that statement is probably true, does that mean that the idea of an unbiased media is impossible? Or is it necessary?
I'm actually doing a huge investigation right now into like the 7 different types of fake news that exist. And the one thing that I've discovered is that all of the current solutions to fake news that are out there tend to rely on large groups of open source individuals in collaboration working together to decide whether a piece of work is disinformation, misinformation, and the 5 other categories that I can't quite remember right now. But and it's really it works because there are so many people involved. But I think where it falls down is that we can't possibly do that for every piece of, the scale is just ridiculous that you're trying to combat with the amount of articles or whatever it is that are coming out. So we've been focusing a lot on the sources of news and looking at the language and the differences in languages that are there on a few select topics. I think what we've discovered is that there is no such thing as unbiased, and I can't imagine a world where it could be true. We heard this morning about how the BBC is censoring its own female presenters from being able to talk about their own problems with the pay gap that they worried about. So even the BBC, which is supposed to stand above because it's got independent funding, is flawed.
And you're a journalist with a background in the UK media. Do you have any experience with this scandal that's breaking now from the BBC?
I was actually negotiating a pay for my new job in the week that scandal came out. Okay. And I can only hope it helped my negotiation. There's actually another pay gap which hasn't yet been reported, which is between the World Service journalists and the UK-based journalists. The UK journalists get paid 1/3 more than the World Service journalists, even though the World Service brings in more money and takes more risks than the UK-based journalists.
I think also one of the things in terms of being a journalist, when I was a journalist, which is a while ago now, there's the whole thing, like you couldn't editorialize, so you've got either it's very fact-based, it had to be very objective, so whatever story we would do, it had to have every side to the story. If there was 2 sides, we needed to have 2 sides. If it was 3 sides, and my producer always said, you cannot editorialize, just say the facts. And I think that the issue these days is everyone's editorializing, and it's hard to see the difference because of the social media. Everybody can be a journalist now. And I think this is a thing, and I think here literacy is really important for everybody, that they don't just take what they read, one article at face value, but that you read also the stories on Fox News or on The Guardian, whatever is the opposite viewpoint of what you have, to kind of get the full picture. And I think this is where we have to be very, very careful, is that we don't just follow the things that we want to hear, because that's very, very easy in media.
For us in the audience, could you describe what it is to editorialize? To
editorialize is to put your view on things, is to say what you think, is write a story, for instance, is to basically say what you think about a certain thing. It's not, these are the facts. This is what happened, where it happened, why it happened, and then you have the people who were involved in the story telling their sides of the story. That's fact-based. Then if you're like, well, I think, this was, if you put your opinion in, that's editorializing. And as a journalist, when I was a journalist, that was a big no-no. You should never put your opinion into something. So,
that said, though, those facts have a certain language. So you might have one American fact-based news, as they all. You might have one newspaper decide that they call someone a freedom fighter, and for another person it's a terrorist, and nobody uses the word terrorist anymore. Yeah. So then, what do you use? And all that. There are so many different ways to describe things. So it's very hard to get.
It is tough. It's very tough. Yeah.
Kat, your creative motto is "Art is truth." Because art is expression in a way, does that mean there are multiple truths? Can you tell us a bit about your motto?
So, the concept of truth, right, is, and I had a problem with Oprah the other day. I love the fact that I can say these things. Oprah's Golden Globe acceptance speech, which a lot of people are going crazy over, and like, oh my God, this is so amazing. And I just thought, okay, yeah, but I've heard other people say this. I've heard other people say it in a better way. And yes, when we start talking about, truths, when the language, as Rosie's bringing up, around trans people and people of trans experience, then became left there trapped in the wrong body and became living your authentic truth or living as your authentic self. And I was like, well, what about other people? Are they their authentic selves, or do they need to figure out what they're doing as well until they find their authentic truths? So truth is subjective. Where I sit and know that Botswana is a beautiful country, somebody else might just say, well, it's beautiful only if you look at these parts. And the truth is, it isn't beautiful in these areas. So it's always a mission of figuring out where you're looking. You can only ever look within certain dimensions unless you turn your head and then discover, oh, look, that's there. So what does this mean to that? Do I need to then switch between these two, or do I just now say, oh, I like this more?
So if your motto is art is truth, does that mean your art is a way of representing the different ways of looking at truth?
Some pieces will speak more about one thing than other pieces. I can write a monologue about suicide but never mention suicide, and just look at what it took to get you to the point of suicide. That is just a certain story within the journey towards suicide. But, it's selective.
Yeah. Phil, you've worked for over 25 years with countless numbers of tribes. You've been all over the world. Whose story needs to be told next?
Whose story is to be told next? Well, I don't know. I mean, I just tell the stories that come to me again. Whether it's, I notice in my travels that women are doing most of the work. So I decided to spend 8 years talking about women's empowerment and how important that was to getting a community out of poverty. Yeah. The latest Crazy Wise was noticing this cultural difference in the way we look at mental health. So what story next, for me anyway, is whatever pops up. So I'm looking now deeply into consciousness. And as I noticed that the people that have these, I end up interviewing hundreds of people, and especially people with that have gone through a severe mental emotional crisis. There's a part of that crisis that's spiritual. And psychologists have noticed this. I heard it in all my interviews, so now I'm drilling down on that. And so it's just, for me, it's just a process of discovery, more or less. Yeah.
Okay, I'd like to switch lanes a bit now. According to a recent survey, 2/3 of American adults get their news from social media. I know many of us use Snapchat, and thus a daily part of the routine is flicking through the Discover page, which bills itself as a sort of Snapchat newsfeed, but is in fact mostly BuzzFeed lists and Kardashian drama, right? So, Moritz, to what extent is social media a legitimate news source for our generation? And if it is not, how does it need to change?
Well, I see social media very much as a third parent in a sense. We were talking about your children last night and how they are brought up. And now we have such easy access to Facebook, to Snapchat, to ridiculous articles about your favorite Disney princess. But there's also a very disturbing news out there, news which has heavy influence on your children and on people who are now becoming of age. And it shapes the way they think, it shapes the way they interpret the world. And it can be very dangerous in one sense. It can radicalize children. It can also, for example, during this epidemic with ISIS, they used social media as their primary recruitment method. But it can also do a lot of good. It can raise awareness. So this also relates back to what is truth or what can be told, and what media should be told. It's a very difficult question to answer.
Rosie, how is it that you would approach, or how is it that you think it should be done, that for our generation where news right now is coming to us through social media, how should big media corporations like the BBC or like CNN use their news and get it through to our generation in the way that we already access news through social media, in a way that remains reliable?
I think that social media is just it's a different village from the village of the 1950s that you would have got your news from, but it's a valid place to go to. You've chosen your friends who you want to follow, and probably far too many of them, and probably not chosen very, very well, certainly in my case. But you nevertheless have. And as long as you realise that the village is only one place to get your news, and that there might be something more to be learnt out beyond the village, then I think it's a perfectly valid way. And also, you tend to trust things that come from people that you know. One thing that I just was thinking about as you were talking is that there's and related to what you're saying about facts, is the things that tend to be the most shared on social media are things that relate to emotions and feelings. Because I think one of the reasons for that is you can't really dispute emotional truths, because it's not something that, it can't be disputed that person feels that way on that day. Whereas facts can always be disputed, so they will create debate, whereas emotional truths create engagement. And one of the ways to build the best engagement with a story is through using the emotions within a story rather than the facts themselves, as long as it's done responsibly.
But if social media is, as you said, like a good place for news to be, and it's a good community for that to happen. I mean, our intake of media news online is controlled by algorithms, the purpose of which is to tailor the content to what we like and enjoy. Like you said, we pick our friends, the algorithms see what we like, and they target everything that we see to that, including news. So to what extent is that an issue, that the only news that we get is sort of inside a bubble on what we like? Does that still make social media that is run by algorithms like a good place for news to actually be read?
It's a huge problem, but it's about recognizing that it's only one source of news, and that there needs to be debate offline. There needs to be, as we already said, reaching out beyond the bubble that you live in, and seeking other sources of news. And that's all about education and telling people why they should be skeptical and how they should be skeptical, and how to read the news in a way that better understands the sources where things are coming from.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, I tend to find that algorithms mess things up, especially as a writer. If you were to go through, my Google search history, a lot of the stuff that I'm looking for is based on trying to build a character or trying to learn more about something in order to figure out whether or not it's something I need to use or not use. And then the next thing I know, all the sort of things that pop up on the social media feeds that allow themselves access to me have absolutely no interest in me. And then I just spend the entire time trying to wade through all of this noise that was relevant at one point. And I tend to find that for people who, as a public figure, people who only know me based on what I've put out rather than what I'm going through. You know, so if I don't tell you that I'm having lunch at this restaurant and I had an amazing afternoon and their burgers are good, you're not going to ask me about lunch or that restaurant.
Yeah.
But then because I put up a post about lunch, burger, restaurant, amazing, all of a sudden that's the only thing you want to engage with me about. You know, and I tend to find that then people don't understand that it's just, it's a link. It's not the entirety to a being, a presence, an issue. And so just, you know, tread with caution with those algorithms.
We're going to finish off the panel soon enough, so this is my final question. Earlier we talked a lot about how reporters in the media and in the arts are, because of their upbringing, because of where they're from, their race, class, their gender, they are prejudiced in some way. To guarantee balance in what stories are told, are diversity quotas necessary in the media and the arts? Phil?
Oh yeah, I think so. I mean, I think we should try as best we can to bring balance to the media.
Through diversity quotas? Through actual rules that say that this many people of this gender have to be in the company?
You know, I'm afraid of strict rules and bureaucracy. But I think there has to be a way that all voices can reach the public, or many different voices can reach the public. And then people can choose between what they want to listen to, or at least have the ability to listen to different points of view. Just like you say, all of us have grown up with a certain cultural lens, and that defines our reality. So there can be no truth complete that's separate from that.
Okay.
And so I think just having a good diversity balance, it just makes common sense.
But I would queer, you know, the sense of diversity. It's been one of those hot words. But when diversity is seen as everything other than white male, it becomes a problem.
Well, I guess what I'd say is, I'm talking about as well for Michelle. You said that, you know, at the Open Forum, I can only assume that at the Open Forum it's a very progressive outlook. Would you need a quota on diversity of opinion? That you have people from all sides of the political spectrum, you know, talking, as in, when I say diversity, and when we use diversity as the theme for this entire event, we mean diversity in opinion, diversity in people. And I think when, the combination of those two is what diversity should be. Because if it's everything other than white male, that's no longer diversity.
Well, it does incorporate, and you know, this idea that the white male is then the standard of what normalcy is, and then anything other than that is adding diversity. So, oh, I'm hearing an opinion other than. And I'm like, okay, but not all white males think the same. So we don't need to bring all the other people in immediately. Let's find out how different these white males are from each other. And then from there, also bring in other people who might be able to add or challenge them. But for the most part, you know, being this, and then meeting a white male or a white female who then thinks they've got more privilege than I do. And I'm like, babe, do you know my life? Like, you really need to find out how much has been invested in this, because I'm not just your average brown-skinned person.
Okay.
So this idea of white privilege, we do still have brown-skinned people walking around with white privilege. So then for you to put a brown-skinned person into a room and say that's diversity, I'm like, no, that's just That's just another like over-tanned white person. You know?
Well, this is the thing. I mean, we look at it at the World Economic Forum too. We have more than 60 nationalities that work there. We have huge ethnic diversity. We have lots of women that work there. But it's not really diverse because we all come from a certain educational level. We all come from certain privilege. So yes, visually we're diverse, but are we really? No, not really. So this is the thing too. You have to look at. I don't even like the word diversity so much anymore. I prefer the word inclusivity. Inclusion is that, and I wish this was my quote, but it's not. But it's like the world and what we're doing. It's like a party, and everybody's invited, and everybody gets asked to dance. And to me, that's kind of my beautiful view of what the world should be. Is like a party where everybody gets invited and gets asked to dance. So when you're looking at diversity, you have to not only look at diversity of ethnic, gender, religious, opinion, but also, you know, vertical, horizontal, that's diversity.
And I mean, as you said before, at the open forum, you choose the topics that you want to talk about. So if there's not a diversity in the upbringing, in the class that people are coming from, you won't have diversity in the stories that are told.
Yeah.
Right? Thank you so much for these fantastic insights. I'd like to bring our panel discussion to a close and remind the audience that you now have 5 minutes to discuss what you've heard with the people you're sitting with. But before I go into that a bit more, I'd like a round of applause for our panelists. As I said, you now have 5 minutes to discuss what you've heard with the people you're sitting with. Take this opportunity to generate some questions for our panelists. You can either share them via Twitter, we have the hashtags on the screens here. So use that hashtag and share them via Twitter, and I'll be relaying these questions to our panelists. Or you can share them in person by raising your hand. When you ask a question in person, our question team will bring you a microphone. Please stand, give your name, and ask your question. Remember to make your questions clear, and if it's to a particular panelist, let me know. Thank you.
Baby, lay on back and relax. Kick your pretty feet up on my dash. No need to go nowhere fast. Let's enjoy right here where we at. Who knows where this road is supposed to lead? We got nothing but time. As long as you right here next to me, everything's gonna be alright. If it's meant to be, it'll be, it'll be. Baby, just let it be. If it's meant to be, it'll be, it'll be. Baby, just let it be. So won't you ride with me, ride with me, see where this thing goes. If it's meant to be, it'll be, it'll be. Baby, if it's meant to be.
I don't mean to be so uptight, but my heart's been hurt a couple times by a couple guys that didn't treat me right. I ain't gonna lie, I ain't gonna lie, 'cause I'm tired.
Able to,
You did really well.
yeah, oh, the mic's back on.
It's funny, I don't know if I told you.
Okay, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to go back to the panel. We're going to take questions from the audience, and there's an incredible amount of questions that have come in through Twitter, so we're going to be sharing them as well with the panelists. Are there any questions from the audience? Yes, Gabe. Yeah, so just stand, give your name and your question, and if you're directing to a specific panelist.
All right, so my name's Gabriel, and this question's for anybody. So, like, if you're in a tough financial situation, right, and you're like you see a way to get out as a journalist or like as a theater performer or something, and it's to tell a truth, but it's not a truth that you agree with. How do you deal with that?
Please.
Well,
I'm happy to start on that. I used to live in Qatar for 9 years, a heavily politically controlled place where they technically say there's freedom of press, but I used to get arrested all the time. It's absolute bullshit that there's freedom of press. I hope I can use the word bullshit. I think that's allowed, right? We regularly got asked to do stuff that we didn't like, and quite often when we were doing a story that, let's say, FIFA down the road here may not like, then FIFA would come to us and say, well, we'd like to offer you a very highly paid job that's going on right now, but it will, of course, mean you'll have to give up this other story. So my answer to that is mainly just no.
Yeah, I think it does take some strength to get to the point where you realize whether you're alive and creating art for money, or you're creating art because you are compelled to. And if your art is writing, I could write myself into the millions, but those are stories I don't want to tell. And yes, I could be much better off than I am now trying to write, queer-specific content from a country that nobody really pays attention to, but nobody's writing that anyway. So let's make a story that matters rather than a story that's going to make money.
Even beyond people not caring about the LGBT stories that you want to tell in Botswana, the homosexual sexual acts are technically illegal in Botswana, correct?
Well, anything that's not missionary style is illegal in Botswana. And yeah.
Is that literally true?
It's literally true, and it's because we inherited colonial laws. So, the Buggery Act, which was put into state in the UK in 1533, still has remnants in, its successors are still in place in Botswana.
Yeah.
And we inherited that in 1855, and it's still there. So basically, anything that was in place eons ago is still criminalized in Botswana. But we're not telling those stories, are we?
Yeah.
No, but I think in terms of, I don't think you can take enough showers to kind of wash that off to when you're compromising your own values. And I think for one piece of advice that I can give you guys, don't compromise your values.
Yeah.
Don't ever compromise your values.
Right.
There is always, I mean, you don't always also have to do your art. You can go and be a waitress for a while or a waiter, and there will be a job like that will keep you going until you've got a chance to do what you really want to do.
Absolutely. Never compromise your values.
No, thank you. Do we have any other questions from the audience? Please. No, I think, sorry. Yeah. Sorry.
Hello, my name is India. So I have a question for Kat. As you are transgender, you must have experienced a lot of maybe sexism or people that haven't agreed with what you've done. And I see also very many differences around us, and I feel like we have improved gender equality and also acceptance of different sexuality and races. Do you believe that at one point in every single country in the world we will all be equal sexuality, race, gender? Do you think everyone will be accepted at one point? And if so, will it happen soon?
I have a very quick answer to that, and it's no. Only because as human beings, we are creatures of difference. It would be wonderful. Every single time people talk about gender equality, I'm like, how many genders, babes? When we talk about gender equality, who is being represented? A thing that I brought up when I was starting my social transition was the fact that, by mere virtue of transitioning, I now need to query when I need to go in and negotiate for a salary, because am I going to be the highest paid woman simply because of the privilege that I once had, and then, transitioned into, oh, well, guess what? Now you have a glass ceiling. If you just stayed on the other side, life would be much better. You could demand the millions, but now you're a woman. So earn like a woman. So I still think there's a lot that needs to be done. Full equality? Never. Close to decent treatment? Probably when your generation has grandchildren. There's still a lot of resistance. If you were to ask your friends right now, how many of them will be comfortable earning less than their spouse, just so that they let them go for it, most people would say, no, I want to be able to support myself rather than I want to be supported by somebody else. So as long as we're all still striving to have top, all sort of the top jobs, the people who have the ability will always get there faster than the people who should get there.
Thank you. We've got a question here from Twitter, from Iona. It's to Rosie. Have you ever faced a serious backlash on a story you have told?
Yes. There are many, but I will choose one that is probably most relevant to you. So we decided to take 6 young Qataris over to the Amazon jungle during the World Cup in Brazil, so that they could build a school. There would be some element of cross-cultural learning. And one of the things that people don't know about Qatar is they have a huge charitable side to the country. There is a huge charitable side to the country, and not just terror funding type charity, but lots of really amazing stuff that they do that is very badly represented. So we thought this would be a really interesting thing to do and to tell a different part of the story. So we took these 6 kids, which took a long time to find because we wanted to have boys and girls, and there were very few parents that would allow that. But over a period of time, we persuaded the fathers of the girls, who were very pious girls who prayed 5 times a day, that they would be safe, that they would have a place for prayer, that everything would be respected, that they would have different areas for sleeping, etc., etc. And these brave young people got together, and they were heading off to the airport. And as the royal family do in Qatar, and as most people in Qatar do, and the whole Gulf do, they took off their headscarves when they got to the airport. And we were filming them. The idea was we were going to upload a film a day. They took off. Somebody sent me a film. I uploaded it when they landed in Brazil. we had taken what we thought was reasonable caution about what was in the film, and it was literally just the girls and boys heading onto a plane, off a plane, and seeing Rio de Janeiro for the first time as the World Cup was going on. But they're not there to see the World Cup, they're there to go and build a school. The reaction to the girls taking off their headscarves led to 18 death threats, for calls for the head of the country to excommunicate the families of these women. The fathers lost their jobs. It was a complete and utter disaster. Vodafone, who had been one of the sponsors of the thing, who had given us some contributed to the funding, rather than saying, oh, we're going to stand by these girls, decided to pull all the funding on day 2 of a 30-day journey in Brazil. Luckily, we had some insurance in place, which meant that they could continue, and they built the school till the end. And it resulted in quite vicious laws in Qatar against against threats being made on social media, and 18 men went to jail for a short period of time for the death threats, which has resulted in further clamping down on press freedoms, which is not a good result.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, just about
on that note.
Will we open it up to more questions from the audience?
Hi, my name is Gil. I have a question specifically for Ms. Garthwaite, Rosie. Early on in the panel, you were talking about the various different kinds of fake news when talking about what stories should be told. And it reminded me of this one news outlet called The Onion. It's a satirical news outlet. They've published a lot of, for lack of a better term, fake news stories, basically a lot of comedic, fictional stories, as well as comedically reporting on real stories. So what I wanted to ask you is, do you think there's any value in satire and telling those kinds of stories, or do you think it does more harm than good, especially when other mainstream news outlets take those fictitious stories at face value seriously?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's just a sign of today's world's stupidity when you see that all the time. Where there's another one in the Middle East, it's very funny as well, and there's one in England as well, and there's one, I'm sure every country's got one just like The Onion. I mean, I think there's a huge value in satire, and I'm sure that probably some of your theatre productions take on some of that. I don't know.
You kind of need to do it.
Yeah.
It's how to weave around.
It's the way to cleverly criticize, and in many countries where you can't criticize, satire is the only form of criticism, the most direct. You'll see it in South Africa. There was some brilliant stuff during the apartheid, and I'm sure I'd love to come up with some clever examples right now, but I don't have any.
I'm really sorry. We're going to have to close this discussion.
Oh, no.
To my dismay. Our time is almost up. However, we do now have a 15-minute idea exchange where the panelists will be here, and anyone in the audience, you can make your way to your next panel, or you can stay here for 15 minutes and talk to our panelists. There's plenty of amazing questions on Twitter that we didn't have time to share. So if your question wasn't asked, please feel free to come up and ask our panelists. I would like to say thank you so much again for being here, and could we have another round of applause for our panelists?